would have been interesting.
Anyway, and then, but that got me completely immersed in this new community that we live in. So I've been doing a lot of stuff there. But then, basic things like, I have boxes and boxes and boxes of pictures.
Yeah, it's like you're going to organize.
And I'm going to organize them. And they're in my attic. And it's like, and I have the National Oregon Housing Coalition archives are still like my responsibility, and I'm trying to get them to be accepted into a university archive. But I'm going to do a shitload of work to get them from here to there. And when am I going to do that? And but I am very proud of myself. My husband and I have way too many books, and they were sort of all scattered around. They were in boxes in the wood. And I just finished taking all the books out. You know that whole, picking up each book and deciding if you want
Oh,
it.
that's impossible, though. I think it's
So I went through all the books. We have 3 boxes to give away. I found 7 duplicates.
Can we all take our seats for the final session, please?
I found 7 duplicates. I found 5 copies. My husband's copy of the artist. I said, which one do you want?
That makes it easier.
But I have finished my book project. I'm very pleased about it. We've got rid of our new house. We now have bookcases for all the books.
Right,
Now I can't fly anymore.
Yeah, see, now you gotta be disciplined.
Easier to carry
my little. Let me tell you what I did
me everywhere I go, but I'm gonna.
I made albums. It took me Charlie
Okay, please keep eating. We're going to come together for the final session before we have our closing with Mr. Don Gathers. So if people could please quiet down so we can hear from our last set of panelists.
So it was fun. It was fascinating. I don't have this anymore. I don't have Twitter. I just have now a bazillion on my phone. I can't keep. Yeah.
Okay, so please continue to feel free to eat and to bring food home.
Yeah.
We're at the end of the day, right?
All right, so we have our final panel of the day that Barbara Brown Wilson has very generously agreed to moderate. So I'll leave it to her to do bios and introductions, but thank you again. This has been a great day, really exciting, and a very long day. And so we've got a great esteemed panelist to continue to excite us. So take it away.
Great. Borrow that.
Thank you so much for having me as a part of this. It's been a wonderful day. I've learned a ton. Really happy to be here. And I know my role is really just to introduce people and then make sure all the questions that you all have get answered. So I'll get to it. I'll go down this way with introductions, and then we'll just hand it officially over to Chad to start us off. So Jeff Fogel is a civil rights lawyer in his 5th decade of practice. He's taught at Rutgers and NYU School of Law. He's a former executive director and legal director of the ACLU New Jersey, senior counsel to New York Civil Liberties Union, legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He's practiced in New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, and for the last decade in Virginia. Jeff has been active locally on issues of criminal justice. He ran unsuccessfully for the Commonwealth Attorney and had housing, and is working closely with FAR and the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition. Sheila Crowley is a national recognized expert on a well-loved nationally recognized expert on low-income housing policy and programs. She retired in 2016 after 17 years as the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, where she led the campaign to establish the National Housing Trust Fund and advocated to protect and expand federal programs that serve the lowest income households. She now is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she teaches housing and homeless policy and organizational practice. She earned a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in social work from VCU. Christine Klepper has 40 years of experience in fair housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. She is a consultant with Housing Choice Partners in Chicago and Mobility Works, a national consulting group. And Chad Willman is an associate professor of German studies at the University of Virginia. His primary research and teaching areas include European intellectual history, Romanticism, and media and social theory. So Chad's going to start us off with a little bit of history, and then we'll get more into practice and into local dynamics.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Laura. So I'm going to play the historian just for a bit. And one of the things I wanted to try to frame is the possibility of knowledge as a public good and the relationship of the university to that public good. Can you hear me? Louis, you can't hear me? It's because you're old. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, you got it? That's good. So in the history of the university in a nutshell, the first universities in kind of 13th century Paris and Oxford were basically nothing more than guilds of students and teachers. And in this sense, they had privileges granted to them from local authorities. In particular, they had privileges granted them from the church, which meant, and I think this is crucial for some of the dynamics we're going to talk about today, is that they were free from all civil jurisdiction. They had their own courts, they had their own rights, they had their own ways to judge and discipline their students, and so they were a community, by and large, set apart from any civitas. It's set apart from any city, any local community, and had very little obligations to that community. And so the history of the university for almost 600 years is a history of strife, is of drunken men going through the streets with impunity and returning to their college dorms, as it were. And but they did play one function that kind of went outside the university, and that was to train clergy, to train lawyers, and to train doctors. But again, I don't think you can call any of that a public good. And this is where I think the American, but also American colleges as well, primarily trained clergy up through the end of the 19th century. And I just want to talk about one kind of historical event that frames the possibility of knowledge as a public good, and that's the 1862 passage of the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act was crucial because the Morrill Act, right in the midst of the Civil War, it was Congress trying one of the first and most massive nation-building projects. And the Morrill Act of 1862, basically the federal government granted states large tracts of land under the conditions that when they sold those tracts of land, that they would use that money to found public institutions or augment the institutions that were already in existence. And I'll just read briefly an excerpt from that act to give you a sense of the ambition, but also the fruits that we continue to enjoy today. So this is from 1862, just directly from the act. And that the money so invested, and after the previous paragraphs had described exactly how they would apportion the land, and so the money so invested shall constitute a perpetual fund, the capital of which shall remain forever undiminished, and the interest of which shall be inviolably appropriated by each state which may take and claim the benefit of this act to the endowment, support, and maintenance of at least one college where the leading object shall be, without excluding other scientific and classical studies, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agricultural and mechanic arts, in such manner as the legislatures of the states may be respectfully prescribed, in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. And I think what's fascinating about this, not only do you have such universities as the University of California, Cornell, that are directly founded by the monies that were endowed by this act, but you also have the addition of science schools at Columbia, places like Columbia, Princeton, and Yale. And also, of course, you have all the A&Ms, or the state agricultural institutions that you can think of. And I think there are two things here that are significant, I would say, for kind of our broader discussion today and the possibility of knowledge as a good that is shared and actually owned and claimed and has a responsibility over a public that extends well beyond the university. One, you notice Columbia, Yale, and Princeton aren't public universities. But they went from being small colleges that trained clergy to being centers of scientific research with massive public investment. And that's something that's oftentimes forgotten, that the private universities are elite universities, especially the Ivy universities, were sent on this long trajectory of massive endowment creation, massive knowledge creation with a massive public investment. So in a sense, that I would claim we have a claim over the goods that they continue to produce. And second, as I said, for the previous 600 years, universities were very internal affairs, right? They were gilded communities. They were guilds, right? They were identified as a guild along with, shoemakers or whatever guilds that they were competing with. And it did produce professional peoples like theologians and doctors and lawyers. But what we see here for the first time is that Congress is saying that knowledge, right, know-how, learning how to farm land better, learning how to create better engines, learning how to produce better medicines, those aren't goods whose income and whose benefits should accrue simply to those who invent them, those who own the patents, but Congress laid a claim over that knowledge by endowing these universities. And I would say that was one of the first American universities endowed by the Morrill Act at the end of the 19th century. And then throughout the 20th century, some of the first institutions anywhere that made that distinction that the know-how and the knowledge that is created in universities is not simply for private consumption and for private benefit. And we can talk about, I'm sure we will, the legacy of that, but this is a significant chapter in the history of universities, and it's a significant, I would say, even more significant chapter for the idea that what happens in universities isn't simply for those who happen to be there, it's for a public who shares all of those goods in common.
Hello? I have a loud voice, so I'm going to try not to be too loud. I probably will be too long, though. So I am from Chicago. I am a consultant, as was mentioned, and my whole thing for the 40 years I've been involved in housing is fair housing and also mobility. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm sort of bringing a concept from Chicago. It originated in Chicago. And then I'd like to help think about how this concept might be localized to work in Charlottesville around the kind of problems that you have. So Chicago and Charlottesville are very different, but I think we all are looking to reduce intergenerational poverty and create inclusive communities. And so that's essentially my life's work. Thank you. So what is mobility? Well, it's a fair housing response to a dual housing market. And we've all talked today about one market for whites and one market for minorities, the highly segregated nature of our housing market. It was created not by accident, but through federal housing policy, private lending practices. I would say the legacy of past discrimination, as well as continuing discrimination, and also fear and intimidation. All of those things have played a role, and where you live matters. How many times have we heard about, your zip code determines your life outcomes? Obviously, not every time, because we have Cornelius here, but so often It is true. And so where you live, especially as a child, is really important. So we have separate and unequal housing markets. I think we all know that. So often our minority neighborhoods are plagued with disinvestment by the government, by businesses, lower performing schools, more crime, just a whole variety of things that can, and that's certainly not every minority community, but it happens often that they become very disadvantaged. And the ironic thing is the dual housing market disadvantages everyone. White people just don't get it. It sort of disadvantages minorities, right? Well, it disadvantages minorities more directly, and so that's where the attention tends to go. I would also say that mobility in inclusive communities, the strategy we use, it's not the only strategy. It's just one small part of this very complicated and complex situation we've gotten ourselves in over the years. But we know that children exposed to trauma in unsafe neighborhoods can experience lasting physical changes, and it can affect their learning. Let's go to the next one, and I'm going to skip that because I don't have time. And so mobility programs were actually created as a result of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The ACLU in Chicago sued the city, HUD, and the CHA for violating the Fair Housing Law because they built, and you know this, big giant silos all along State Street and then Cabrini Green and Rockwell and all these infamous housing developments in Chicago deliberately in black neighborhoods. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's why it was done. It was done to isolate people and to keep black people out of white neighborhoods. So we won that lawsuit, and I say we, I wasn't around for the filing of the suit, but I did work on the program in the mid-70s when it started. So the lawsuit was brought by public housing residents, and I know we have so many of them here today. They took things into their own hands and they said, we will not be segregated, we will not have this, we will file this lawsuit. It was named after the lead plaintiff, Dorothy Gautreaux. It was called the Gautreaux litigation. And the resulting program was called the Gautreaux Assisted Housing Program. So that came about because of public housing residents. So a regional counseling program was developed to help families who wanted to move out of this segregated environment into other parts of the city and the suburbs. If we can go to the next slide, whoops, yes. Gautreaux was studied for quite a bit of time. It lasted for 25 years, moving these 7,000 families. So a book was written about 20 years into the program, and they found that more kids graduated from high school, more kids went on to college, more kids were working and had higher incomes with benefits, and 75% of the families still lived in what we call today opportunity areas. And those areas can be defined in so many different ways, but the idea is that they generally have better schools, lower crime, more employment opportunities, etc. Because of the success of Gautreaux, HUD did a moving to opportunity demonstration, and initially the results didn't show very much progress except in health, which to me as a housing person was really surprising. But it showed lots and lots of health benefits to living in lower poverty areas. Since that time, further research has been done, and they're finding that adults and kids both have higher household earnings, less anxiety, depression, diabetes, obesity, on and on and on. Lots of health, education, life outcome benefits. And the most recent findings show the largest effects are for children who move to low poverty areas under age 13. So they have a 31% estimated increase in lifetime earnings, and they're more likely to attend college. So we know that fair housing, when people have a choice of where they can move instead of walls being built and sort of restricting minority people to certain areas, that important improvements can happen. So HUD decided during the Obama administration to enact the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. And what that essentially means, and mind you, this language is in the federal fair housing law passed in 1968. It's just nobody paid any attention to it. Very deliberately, this was going to be ignored, but it is in the law. Even if Dr. Ben Carson doesn't want this rule to be around, it's around. And it can be used, and I think it can be very helpful to some of the issues you're dealing with in Charlottesville. So just briefly, it says take any HUD grantee, anybody, PHA, city, county, state, if you get HUD money, you must take meaningful action in addition to combating discrimination that overcomes patterns of segregation and fosters inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. And I think that's something we all really need to pay attention to. Gentrification falls under that same category. Let's prevent people from being displaced, and we can think about fair housing as a way to do it. I'm going to skip my conversation about RAD, even though I really want to talk about it. I know you guys managed to keep RAD out of Charlottesville. I commend you. There are so many other cities where all the housing stock is being converted to RAD, all of it. Asheville, Corpus Christi, Chicago is starting conversions. And I mean, it does have some pros. I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but here I am talking about it because I'm going to run out of time. I mean, the pros are that public housing families in converted units get a voucher if a voucher is available, right? So you have a mobility program in place. They're called mobility vouchers, and people can move anywhere they choose. And you can work on those higher rents that are necessary in gentrifying areas. And that Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, along with a couple others, helps us be able to raise rents. Next slide. I'm going to have to move very quickly here. I don't know what my time is, but 1 minute? Oh my goodness, all right. This is a map, HUD's map of Charlottesville, Virginia, and I know it's really, really hard to see. You can go online. HUD has an Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing tool, and this is the racial makeup of Charlottesville, and there's also a chart if we go to the next slide. Lots of tables and maps, all kinds of data on Charlottesville, so you can look at exactly what your situation is here today. And that's part of what HUD did in developing this rule, was to give jurisdictions information that they can work with, so you know what your town really looks like, where your housing needs are, and then here's the best part, you create an action plan to make it happen. You don't just put a report on a shelf. It requires action steps to create inclusive communities. I'm going to skip this slide. That's just what Chicago looks like. And this is my final slide. So the concept I'm bringing to you today is fair housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and it can play out in a variety of different ways. That takes you to the federal level and kind of bypasses, well, not totally, but somewhat bypasses local and state and gives you some tools to work with in creating that inclusive community that you're trying to create here. So best practices in creating such a program include a regional approach. And I was talking to someone earlier about how important it is for Charlottesville and the county to be able to talk to each other. These things don't happen in a vacuum, and a regional approach is usually important. Being very place conscious, supporting resident empowerment, which you have so much of here. Partner with and strengthen local effective organizations. Use data to evaluate and refine strategies. Confront racism. Can't do this without confronting racism. This is a race-conscious, positive approach, and that's what has to happen. We might be able to help in some way through our Mobility Works national consulting project, and we'd be happy to do so if folks want to move forward on a fair housing platform. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today. I was pleased to be invited by Laura, and I have a chance to catch up with my buddy Joy and see my buddy Dave Norris. And an extra added benefit was my comrade in arms, Tony Romano, was here. So this is just a really cool day for me. Anyway, I'm glad to be here in Charlottesville. I worked in Washington for many years. I lived in Richmond for many years before that. I now work back at VCU on a part-time basis. My husband and I live in Matthews County, which is a extremely remote part of Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay. I ran for the General Assembly from the 98th District. I lost badly. I ran as a Democrat in a highly Trump district, but it was a good experience. And what I want to do with my time here today is sort of a grab bag of ideas that I've been collecting as I've been listening to folks as we go along. And I want to thank now his name, I've lost his name, the fellow from Virginia Poverty Law Center who did a lot of the data work, and then Tony in his presentation did a lot of the data work. A couple of big picture things to think about. One is that we should think about housing policy in the context of overall social policy in the United States. And so what are the big areas that we think about in terms of basic human needs? So we think about housing, we think about education, we think about food, and we think about health, okay? So just think about those four sectors. And in education, health, and in food, we do have a degree of entitlement to basic necessities, right? I mean, every kid is entitled to a public education. If you're elderly, poor, and disabled, you are entitled to health care. We don't have a universal health care system, but we are moving towards that, and we do have universal access if you meet eligibility. And we have federal health care standards as well that have to be met. And we have a basic minimum of food that is allotted. It's not great, but if you have no food whatsoever, you are entitled to food in the United States through what is now called the SNAP program. We have a massive federally funded program to provide that. And we have federal food standards, right? You know, you can assume you can go into a grocery store and buy milk that is not going to kill you, right? You can have and that it's not going to be filled with vermin or mold or other kinds of things. We have nothing like that when it comes to the housing sector. The housing sector in the United States is dominated by two primary factors. One is who makes money on it, that is driven by high finance and the real estate sector with some federal regulation, but it's very squishy, it's very wishy-washy. We have fair housing laws, but this new affirmatively furthering requirement is the first time we have really done anything moving out of individual acts of discrimination as opposed to looking at things on a systemic basis. So it's driven by high finance, it's driven by the real estate industry, and not that the other areas are not filtered through race, but housing is filtered through race in the most complete way that you can imagine. There is nothing about the U.S. housing system or anything that approximates U.S. housing policy, if we have such a thing, that cannot be examined, that has to be examined through the lens of race and the history of racism and systemic oppression in the United States. So those are the big, the sort of big themes that I want you to think about in terms of how we try to tackle solving the considerable housing problems we have in the United States, and as they come down to each individual community. I would like to commend to you, if you haven't seen it already, this new book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, which traces the role of the federal government in promoting promoting segregation, not just maintaining segregation, but causing segregation to happen. Now, there is so we do have, I said, there's an entitlement to education, an entitlement to food, an entitlement to health care. There's some minimum standards. Much to the ordinary person in the United States would believe that there is some entitlement to housing, that there is some right to housing in the United States. And there isn't. So all of the programs that fund low-income housing are on the discretionary side of the federal budget. And they are the healthcare programs and the nutrition programs and the income programs are all on the mandatory side of the federal budget. They happen whether Congress shows up or not. Congress has to affirmatively change them. All the low-income housing programs are on the discretionary side of the budget, which means they are subject to annual appropriations, which means that they are subject to the vicissitudes of the political process in a much more extreme way than anything else is. And so what we have in the housing sector in the low-income housing sector, are means-tested programs. You have to meet an eligibility requirement, and your income has to be so low. And it's basically on a first-come, first-served lottery basis. And so it isn't that if you are poor enough, you're going to get something. The only thing that really might work in that is that there are some cities that have right-to-shelter laws, which means that you actually, if you want to enter into a shelter, you can do that. But there's no place where you are entitled to housing at all. The only thing that gets to be an entitlement in housing in our public policy sector is on the home ownership side with all of the tax expenditures, which are about $236 billion this year of tax expenditures, money that does not